The Trae Young era in Atlanta has come to an end, something we probably knew eventually would come given the Hawks' disappointing seasons, reaching the play-in year after year since going to the conference finals in 2021. Trae Young, in a move that happened relatively quickly, is headed to the Washington Wizards while CJ McCollum and Corey Kispert are off to Atlanta. It's possible there is more in the works for the Hawks in terms of acquiring additional players via trade by dumping some of their expiring contracts like that of Kristaps Porzingis or even flipping McCollum. But for now, this is where things stand. Trae Young is now a Wizard, McCollum and Kispert with the Hawks. And while we've had enough time now to let the trade news digest a little bit and see the initial reactions across NBA Twitter, the question now is, what does this really do for each respective team, both for their current state and for the future, and who really came out ahead in this transaction? Well, let's talk about it. Be sure to subscribe, by the way, if you like this type of content. In return, I'll be providing more NBA content like this. Now, it's funny because in my last video, which came out earlier this week, I talked about how, yes, the Hawks don't want Trae Young anymore. They want to trade him. But the problem is they're going to be hard-pressed to actually find a trade partner in a situation that actually makes sense for all parties involved to move Trae Young. I didn't see a lot of pathways for Trae to be moved, and I actually thought there was a real world where Trae was still in a Hawks uniform past the trade deadline, unless the Hawks were willing to give up future assets to get off of Trae's contract. But lo and behold, I could not have been more wrong, because 48 hours later, Young was traded, and they didn't have to give up any draft capital to move on from his contract. I'm surprised it was the Wizards of all teams, because you would have thought the Wizards, a team that is primed in a prime position to tank for the rest of the year and secure a top pick, wouldn't be interested in taking on a player who is probably going to complicate your tanking efforts, given Trae Young is talented enough to give you a few more wins than you otherwise would expect, but also a player that if you want him to stay around long term, you're going to have to cough up a lot of money for him, and a player that, yes, is an elite offensive player, but a defensive liability. Is that the type of player that makes sense for your organization when you're in a full-blown rebuild? Now, what I will say is I was a little surprised by the amount of reactions of folks clowning the Atlanta Hawks for this deal, that they basically gave away Trae Young for peanuts, giving away a star player in his prime, the guy who was the face of your franchise, for an aging veteran on an expiring deal and an average rotational player. Most saying, in what world did the Hawks not even get at least one first-round pick in the deal? Need I remind everyone, there was virtually no trade market for Trae Young. As I talked about in my last video, there were less than a handful of teams across the league that actually had the assets, the cap flexibility, and the roster need for a player like Trae Young and his services. Most contending teams aren't in the market for a ball-dominant lead guard who isn't going to give you anything defensively. And so when there isn't a market of teams being interested in Trae Young, and you're in today's CBA environment with the apron rules and teams being wary of taking on max salaries for small guards who are fringe-level stars, yes, I know that's going to bother some people by me making that statement, but at this time, based on what we've seen from Trae Young this season and last season, he is a fringe-level star, not a perennial all-star or a superstar like some Trae stans claim that he is. And no, most teams aren't going to be interested in trading for Trae. And when there's little interest and his trade value is at its lowest that it's ever been, most teams don't want to overpay when he's due for a contract extension as well. This is the result that you get. This is the return that you're going to get. You're not going to get some crazy haul for a player that has low trade value and minimal interest throughout the league, especially when on top of that, teams know the Hawks want to get rid of him, so it reduces their leverage as a result of it. Now, I think the Wizards made out well in this trade, all things considered, especially when you consider the asset management that they've done over the years, which I'll get to. But I actually thought the Hawks came out of this better than expected. The fact that they got out of Trae's contract when most teams didn't want him, they didn't have to give up any draft capital as an incentive for a team to take on his max contract and whatever large future contract he's inevitably going to sign, and they bring in a veteran on an expiring deal, a veteran, by the way, who actually fits better on the roster and how the Hawks want to play, but also a veteran they don't have to commit to long term. They could let him walk in free agency to free up that cap space they otherwise would have given to Trae Young, or they can sign him to a team-friendly extension should things work out and he fits and it pushes them to a little playoff run. And then Corey Kispert. I know some like to poke fun at the Hawks essentially trading Trae Young for Kispert, given McCollum probably isn't going to be part of their long-term plans, but Kispert is a decent rotational player that is a solid three-point shooter that can help space the floor. Yeah, he hasn't been playing much this season, and that's probably why he's fallen out of good graces, but he's on a reasonable contract, a tradable contract, and again, you didn't have to give up any draft capital in this deal, not even a second-round pick for a player that was otherwise going to be very hard to move. It's not like there was going to be a bidding war for Trae Young. Now, Do I think this makes the Hawks any better? Maybe a little bit. I mean, they were already playing better without Trae Young anyway. Now they add a veteran guard that isn't going to command the ball as much, and it allows some of their young core players to thrive in their roles, most notably Jalen Johnson. But no, I don't think this move makes them a contender by any means, but it allows them to move on from the Trae Young era without having to move any future assets, which is important. Now for the Wizards, while I don't really get why they were interested in Trae Young, and for those that know me, I'm not high at all on Trae Young as a player. I don't think his game translates to winning at the highest levels, and he isn't a player that you build your franchise around. But when you at least look at it from an asset management perspective, the Wizards went from moving Bradley Beal for Chris Paul and got a bunch of second-round picks in that deal, then flipping Chris Paul and agreed to take on Jordan Poole's contract while getting a future first-round pick from the Warriors. They then flipped Poole and his contract by taking on the expiring contract of CJ McCollum and have now flipped McCollum into Trae Young. When you look at it that way, turning Bradley Beal, who was a negative asset at that time on a supermax contract with a no trade clause, and getting multiple second-round picks, a first-round pick, and turning all that into Trae Young, that's just great asset management by their front office. Now, it's resulted in a lot of losing. The Wizards have been bad for quite some time now. Last season, they were virtually unwatchable, but they're making steps in the right direction to position themselves up nicely in the future. And that will especially be the case if they land a top 3 pick. Now, they could get unlucky in the draft and fall outside of the top 4, but more likely than not, they're going to get a top 7 pick at a minimum in a pretty stacked draft class to add to their young core. And I think as long as they don't view Trae Young as their franchise player that they try to build around him going forward to try and make win now type moves, and instead use Trae Young as a building block to develop some of these younger guys that are in need of an elite playmaker. And if Trae buys into that role, that this isn't necessarily going to be his team, not for the long term anyway, and doesn't try to take away opportunities from guys like Sar, Trey Johnson, Coulibaly, then it's a win of a trade for the Wizards. I have my doubts though. I have my doubts that Trae Young is truly going to allow that to happen and really fit with this team and really just treat this as a bad team for which he has the green light to do whatever he wants to try and recoup his value, put up big numbers so he can get another max contract extension and then leave in free agency. I hope for the Wizards' sake that doesn't happen, but I'm cautious about that potentially transpiring. So look, well, I never like crowning a winner in a given trade when we haven't really seen how the deal has impacted each respective team, but I actually think this was a win for both the Wizards and the Hawks. I know I'm in the minority in the opinion because most people think the Hawks got fleeced and can't believe that that was all they got for their star player, but as I've said before, I'm not really sure what you expect when hardly anyone was interested in trading for Trae Young, especially with the way that he's been playing this season. The Hawks made out well given the circumstances they find themselves in. The Wizards got a player they can work with to help with their budding young core, especially when you consider the preceding transactions that have ultimately led to them acquiring Trae Young by way of initially trading Bradley Beal a few years ago. Time will tell, of course, who ultimately comes ahead in this deal. Of course, reports are indicating that the Hawks are not done, and there have been rumblings that it's possible Trae likely won't be playing much this season for the Wizards to help with their tanking efforts, but for now, I thought this was a win-win trade for both sides. Let me know what you guys thought of the trade though. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.